She hummed the morning song over a stranger's grave. The king behind her dropped to his knees. In the hill country of Varnoth, the old women said this: "The dead hear only what is true." It meant that flowers placed in vanity would wilt before dawn. Eulogies spoken for reputation alone would scatter like smoke before they reached the ears of the gone. But a voice that carried real grief, real love for a stranger even, real tenderness offered without witness or reward, that voice, the old women swore, could crack the stone of the underworld and let the lost ones through to their rest. Marin Ashvale had believed it since she was 7 years old and had knelt beside a sparrow dead in the lane and hummed until her knees left rings in the mud. She did not know whether the sparrow heard. She only knew she meant every note. She still had the single gray feather she'd tucked into her coat pocket that morning. She had never been able to throw it away. Chapter 1. The Unmarked Stone. The graveyard at Cold Hollow Crossing had 2 kinds of graves. The kind with carved names and fresh-cut flowers brought by families who returned every season, and the kind with nothing. A raw heave of earth, a field stone set at the head, and silence so complete it felt like an accusation. Marin found the new unmarked grave on the eastern slope during the Thursday she was permitted to take her half-day. She worked in the laundry of Lord Cressen's estate, boiling, wringing, hanging, 6.5 days a week, and on Thursday afternoons she walked. The walking was the only thing that kept her sane, and the graveyard was where she always ended up, because nobody went there without purpose, and so nobody bothered her. She crouched beside the fieldstone. The mound was perhaps 2 weeks old. No name, no flower, no candle stub. Not even a weed had grown yet, because the earth was too fresh and too alone. Someone had died and been put in the ground and left as completely as if they had never existed. Marin sat back on her heels. She was 22, slight, with dark hair the wind always pulled loose and gray eyes that people usually looked through on their way to someone more useful. She had no wolf. That was the fact of her life, the thing that set her below every ranking. The reason she was in the laundry and not training with the garrison or mated to a respectable merchant. An omega without a wolf was not truly an omega. She was merely a woman, and in Varnoth that carried its own taxonomy of invisibility. She unpinned the gray feather from the inside of her coat lapel. She kept it there always, against the lining, and pressed it into the mound beside the fieldstone. Then she began to hum. The morning song had no words. It had never had words, because grief did not need them. It was a low, winding melody that climbed and fell like breath, like the tide, like sleep at the edge of a fever. Marin had learned it from her grandmother, who had learned it from hers, back and back into a lineage of women who had known how to tend the forgotten. Her voice was not remarkable. It was a common, warm soprano, nothing trained or gilded, but she gave it without reservation. She did not hear the horses stop on the road. She did not hear the boots on the grass. She did not hear anything until the sound of a man falling to his knees behind her cut through the song like a bell. Chapter 2. The King in the Grass. Marin spun around. He was enormous, the way mountains were enormous, the way things were large that had no need to announce it. He wore a riding coat of deep charcoal, plain enough that only the cut betrayed its cost, and he was on his knees in the grass 6 feet behind her, with both hands pressed flat to his thighs and his head bowed. Behind him, at the road, 4 mounted guards sat their horses in frozen, wide-eyed silence. Marin stood up so fast she nearly overbalanced. "What?" She looked at the guards. She looked at the kneeling man. She looked at the grave as if it might explain something. I'm sorry. I wasn't trespassing. I only come here on Thursdays." The man raised his head. She went quiet. His face was angular and weathered, perhaps 35, with the bone structure of someone whose ancestors had been carved from the same granite as the Varnoth ridgelines. His eyes were the amber of late afternoon light on river water, and they were wet. Not overflowing, he was too controlled for that, but undeniably wet, the way a man's eyes go when something reaches inside him and squeezes. She knew him then. With a lurch she felt in her chest. Not personally. From the proclamation boards, from the coins, from the whispers of every household in the county. Aldrich Veranoth, Alpha King of the Crestland territories. Here, on his knees, in the mud of the eastern slope. You knew him. His voice was low and roughened, and it was not a question. Maren shook her head. No, I don't know who is buried here. There's no name. Something moved across his face, a wave of pain so sharp and brief that she almost looked away to give him privacy. He did not get up. My brother, he said. He died 3 weeks ago of fever. He had refused the title and the lands. He lived quietly. He asked to be buried plainly. I honored it. A pause, in which his jaw worked. I did not think that plain meant alone. Maren looked at the fieldstone. She looked at the gray feather still pressed into the earth. She looked at the king of all the Crestland territories kneeling in the grass over his brother's quiet grave, and she felt the ordinary human weight of the thing settle into her lungs. I didn't know, she said quietly, but I'm glad I came. The dead hear only what is true. I was telling him the truth, that someone was sorry he was alone. Aldrich Veranoth looked up at her. He had very good eyes for a man of enormous power. Most men of enormous power never looked at anything. They only received looking. But his gaze moved over her face as if he was actually reading it. Who are you? She told him her name. He repeated it, just Maren, as if testing the weight of something. Chapter 3. The Wolves and the Wolfless. He came back the following Thursday. Maren nearly turned around and walked home the moment she saw his horse tethered at the road. She stayed because the only honest reason to leave would have been fear, and she did not want to be the kind of person fear ruled. He was sitting on the grass beside the grave. Alone this time, no guards or guards hidden far enough that they gave the illusion of solitude. He had brought a single white foxglove and laid it against the fieldstone. He stood when he heard her. I wanted to bring something, he said. I didn't know what Bren would have wanted. Maren looked at the foxglove. It was a good choice. It grows wild here. He'd have seen it from anywhere on these slopes. She sat down at a comfortable distance, and he sat too, and for a while they were quiet with the grave between them and the wind carrying the smell of late summer heather. You come here every Thursday. He was working something out. It's my half day. I work at the Crescent Estate. He glanced at her hands, red from the hot water, knuckles a little swollen. He did not comment, but she had the sense he filed it somewhere. You have no wolf, he said. He said it the way a careful man states a fact he wants to understand, not the way a dismissive man states a flaw. No. She kept her voice even. She had had years of practice. I never shifted. There's no explanation for it. It simply didn't come. Does it trouble you? She thought about the real answer rather than the polite one. It used to. Less now. I found other things to tend. She nodded at the graves around them. Other purposes. In Veranoth law, he said slowly, a wolfless Omega has no standing to inherit, to hold rank, to claim bonding consideration from any Alpha above the 3rd tier. A pause. He was watching a cloud cross the sun. I wrote that law, 10 years ago, for administrative clarity. She said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would be both true and comfortable. It seemed practical at the time, he continued, and the words had a careful self-examination in them that surprised her. A framework. I did not think about what the framework felt like from the inside. Maren turned a blade of grass between her fingers. Most frameworks don't. He looked at her then, and this time the look lasted long enough to be something other than assessment. Chapter 4. What the Song Carries. Over the weeks that followed, 4 Thursdays, then 5, Aldrich came each time, and the visits stretched longer. He was a man of few words, but genuine ones, and Maren found that she could match his silences without anxiety, which was unusual. Most silences with powerful people were traps, filled with unspoken expectations. His were simply rooms she was permitted to stand in. She learned things. That his brother Bren had been the gentler of the two of them, a scholar, a gardener, someone who had chosen a small cottage near the Cold Hollow River over any estate. That Aldrich had not been present at the death because a summit in the Northern Territories had run 3 days over, and the rider with the news had arrived 6 hours after Bren was gone. That he had not told anyone how badly this was eating him, because being the Alpha King meant you performed certainty for everyone else's benefit, constantly, without intermission. "Who tends you?" Marin asked on the 5th Thursday, and watched the question land on him like something he'd never encountered in that form. He did not answer for a long time. "My advisors manage the affairs of the kingdom. My beta general manages the campaigns." "That's not what I asked." A longer silence. A crow landed on a nearby stone and examined them both skeptically. "No one," he finally said. "No one tends me." Marin nodded. She did not offer herself as a solution. She only acknowledged the truth of it, the way she acknowledged the truth of unmarked graves, without flinching, without fixing, without pretending it was less than it was. She began to understand in those weeks why the wolf had not come to her. It was not a wound. It was a particular shape of life, one that made her available to tend what others flew past. She did not need the speed of the wolf. She had the stillness of the one who stays. On the 6th Thursday he arrived before her and was sitting with his back against a different stone, reading a letter that he folded away when she appeared. He looked up, and something in his expression had shifted. A slight loosening around the eyes, the quality of a man who had been waiting for a specific thing and was relieved it had arrived. She understood with a quiet, rootless shock that the specific thing was her. She sat down. She was not sure what to do with the understanding, so she filed it away and poured the afternoon's tea from the flask she'd taken to bringing, and handed him a cup, and he took it with both hands around the warmth in a way that suggested no one had handed him a cup of tea in a long time. Chapter 5. The court's verdict word inevitably escaped the way water escapes, not through any single crack, but through the accumulated porousness of things. By the 7th Thursday, there were whispers in the county that the Alpha King had been seen repeatedly at Cold Hollow Crossing in the company of a wolfless laundress from the Crescent estate. The whispers reached the estate on a Wednesday. Lord Crescent called Marin to his study, where he stood at his window with his hands behind his back, and told her that her behavior was an embarrassment, that she had apparently been inserting herself into the king's presence through some manipulation he didn't care to examine, and that she was dismissed effective immediately. He told her this with the calm authority of a man who has never considered that he might be wrong about anything, and has found life generally cooperative in confirming this. Marin packed her small trunk. She owned very little, and she was in the lane with it before dark. She had nowhere particular to go. She had a cousin in Feldwick, 4 hours' walk to the south. She had the gray feather in her lapel, which she touched when she needed grounding. She had her 2 hands and her grandmother's song, and the knowledge that she had not, in fact, done anything wrong. She walked. She did not go to the graveyard on Thursday. It seemed, under the circumstances, that continuing was not available to her. Chapter 6. What the King Discovered. Aldrich arrived at the Cold Hollow graveyard on the 8th Thursday, and found it empty. He waited longer than was reasonable. He was aware, in the way of a man who has learned to read terrain, that something was wrong. Not with the grave. The foxglove he'd brought had been joined by a small sprig of something dried and fragrant, tucked against the stone by her hands on one of their visits, and it was still there. Something was wrong with the particular quality of absence that the afternoon had. He rode to the Crescent estate. Lord Crescent greeted him with a bow so deep it was practically archaeological, and offered wine, and said whatever was needed with the king's pleasure, of course. The estate was at his disposal. Aldrich asked very quietly about Marin Ashval. The quality of Crescent's answer, the stumbling, the recalibration, the attempt to frame her dismissal as beneficial housekeeping, told Aldrich everything he needed to know about what had happened. He had been ruling people for 15 years. He could read the specific grammar of a man who has done something he suspects was stupid, and is not yet sure how stupid. You dismissed her. Aldrich's voice was the temperature of early February rivers. The appearance of impropriety, my Lord King. She visited a public graveyard on her permitted half-day. She was there before I was. She did not seek me out. I sought her. A pause. You punished her for existing in the same place I chose to be. Crescent had gone the color of old paste. Where is she? It took 2 hours to trace her to Feldwick, to her cousin's crowded house where she had arrived the previous night with her trunk and her dignity intact, and an expression, her cousin reported to the writer Aldrich sent ahead, that said she had expected nothing different and was not going to waste any tears on it. Aldrich rode himself. The 4 guards came because they could not stop him. He found her in the cousin's small garden, sitting on an upturned crate, mending something by the last light. She looked up and went very still. He dismounted. He did not perform the dismounting. He simply got off the horse and walked toward her through the gap in the hedge and stopped when he was close enough to see the tiredness around her eyes and the careful neutrality she'd arranged over her face. You should have sent word, he said, and he heard that it came out rougher than he intended, because the thought of her walking 4 hours in the dark with a trunk was one of those things he apparently felt physically. I didn't think I was owed a farewell. She folded the mending in her lap. I had no formal agreement with you. I was simply a woman you talked to on Thursdays. No. The word came out with a conviction that surprised even him. No, you were not simply anything. She looked at him for a long moment. The last light was coming over the rooftop in slanted gold, and it caught in her gray eyes, and he understood, with the absolute clarity that comes perhaps 3 times in a life, what his wolf had been trying to tell him since the moment he'd knelt in the grass and heard a voice that carried only truth. Marin. He said her name the way he'd said it the first time, like weighing something, but this time the assessment was already complete. I have spent 15 years building frameworks, laws and ranks and taxonomies of worth, and I knelt in the grass at my brother's grave because a wolfless laundress hummed the truth over a stranger, and it broke me open in the way that only real things can. He stopped. He was not a man who made long speeches, but he needed her to understand. I do not want to go back to my court and leave you here. You are the king. Her voice was careful. Your court has opinions about what you should want. Yes, and my wolf has opinions that outrank them all. He watched her carefully. But what does Marin Ashvale want? Nobody had ever asked her that. Or if they had, they'd asked it as preamble to telling her it wasn't available. She felt the question move through her the way the Mourning song moved, starting low, climbing, finding the resonant thing inside the chest. I want, she said slowly, to not be invisible, to have work that is real, to be near someone who actually sees me, rather than the space I'm taking up. She paused. And I want Bren's grave to have flowers every week. Someone should know his name. Aldrich sat down on the other upturned crate, which creaked worryingly under him. He put his forearms on his knees. He was 6 feet from her, and in the diminishing light his expression had the quality of a man who has put down something very heavy and is feeling the strange lightness of his own hands. I'll have the stone carved, his name and his dates, and below that, he chose a quiet life and lived it well. He looked at her. And I'll need someone who knows how to tend what's been forgotten, if you'll take the position. She looked at him with those gray, through-you eyes. What position is that? A very slight lift at the corner of his mouth. We can negotiate the title. I've been told I write bad law. I could use someone willing to tell me so. Chapter 7. The carved name. It took the royal stonecutter 6 days to carve the inscription on Bren Varanoth's new stone. Aldrich arranged it privately, going himself to oversee the final cut. Bren Varanoth. Brother, scholar, gardener. He chose a quiet life and lived it well. Marin came with him and stood at a slight distance while he had his time with the grave, a private, unperformed grief that she recognized and honored by not watching directly. Then she came and stood beside him, and they were quiet together in the way they had learned to be quiet together, which was its own form of language. He had, in the 6 days, managed the following: a conversation with his beta general that resulted in a formal review of the Wolfless Omega standing laws, a discussion with his head of household about a role with genuine authority, not a decorative position invented to justify proximity, and one very uncomfortable hour with Lord Cresson, at the end of which Cresson had personally written Marin a letter of formal apology, in a hand so shaky with nerves it was nearly illegible. Marin had read the letter, folded it neatly, and said she accepted the apology, by which she meant she was putting it down, and not carrying it further. She did not want his contrition. She had never wanted anything from powerful men but to be left in peace, and now she wanted one thing more: to not be required to shrink. Aldrich had been watching her for days now, had invited her to take rooms in the nearby Cold Hollow Inn at the Crown's expense, while the arrangements sorted themselves, and had shared a number of meals at a table where she was permitted to disagree with him about everything, and had discovered that she disagreed with him with a precise, unhurried intelligence that made him feel more alive than any war council. She was not impressed by him. She was interested in him, which was incomparably better. "My court will push back," he told her one evening. "There will be people who cite the laws I wrote, who will say a wolfless woman has no appropriate standing. Will you agree with them?" He looked at her across the table. "I wrote those laws. I can unwrite them, and I will." She picked up her cup. "Then we'll manage." He watched her, and his wolf was very loud. Chapter 8. What is True? On the first evening of the autumn rains, Aldrich came to find Marin in the small library the Cold Hollow Inn maintained, 3 shelves of well-thumbed books, a fire, and a window that ran with water. She was reading. She did not look up immediately when he came in, finishing her sentence first, which he had already learned was a thing she did, and which he found, irrationally, very endearing. "I want to tell you something," he said. She looked up. He had thought about how to say this, and had decided that thought was the wrong approach, and truth was the correct one. "My wolf recognized you on the first day, in the graveyard. That is why I knelt, not only from grief, though the grief was real. My wolf recognized something it had been trying to find in every courtroom and battlefield and diplomatic hall for 15 years, and found it in a wolfless woman humming over a stranger's grave, and simply went down." The fire crackled. "A wolf," Marin said carefully, "recognizing someone who has no wolf." "It's not about the wolf." He sat down across from her. "My wolf recognized you. You. Not your rank or your standing or your designation. The thing inside you that makes you stop for sparrows, and stay for strangers and tell the truth, even when silence would serve you better." He paused. "I have been among powerful people my whole life, and very few of them are real in the way you are real. My wolf has excellent taste." Marin sat with this for a moment. The gray feather was pinned in her lapel. She touched it, the familiar small grounding, and felt the sparrow from the lane at age 7, and her grandmother's hands over hers, shaping the song. "The dead hear only what is true. I'm not going to stop being who I am," she said. "I will not be decorative or convenient. If I think you've written a bad law, I will say so. If you need tending and are too proud to admit it, I will tend you anyway. And I will go to that graveyard every Thursday, for as long as I am capable of walking." "I know." He reached across the small space between their chairs, and laid his hand palm up on the arm of hers, not reaching for her hand, just offering. Just available. "I'm not asking you to be anything else. I've had enough of useful things. I want true ones." Marin looked at his open hand. She looked at his amber eyes, which were entirely readable at this proximity, and were saying one thing without any complexity at all. "Here." She put her hand in his. His fingers closed. Outside, the rain came harder, and the fire burned, and the thing between them, that true and undecorated thing, became official in the way that only quiet moments can make official. Epilogue. 1 year later. Autumn came again to Cold Hollow Crossing, and the eastern slope of the graveyard was no longer its same self. Bryn Varanoth's stone was carved and settled and surrounded by the winter heathers that Maren had planted in spring, and that had improbably taken. The foxglove had returned on its own. There were 2 white candles in glass holders against the stone, and they were lit. Maren knelt in the familiar groove the grass made for her. She had been here enough that the grass knew her shape now, and she hummed. The morning song was the same as it had always been, low and winding, no words, only the truth of presence. She hummed it all the way through, for Bren, for the other unmarked graves on the slope that she had learned something of over the past 12 months, for the sparrow in the lane, for all the quiet lives that deserved witness. Behind her, she heard boots on the grass, and she did not startle. Aldrich sat beside her, actually sat, cross-legged in the grass, like a man who has been here enough times to know how long she takes, and has made peace with it. He was dressed plainly. He was almost always plain now, when they were here. The cold Hallow Crossing graveyard seemed to do something to him that his throne room couldn't, which was one of the reasons she had never asked him to stop coming. She finished the song. Mirabelle sent her regards, he said, meaning his head of household, who had become, improbably, one of Maren's firmest advocates. The formal recognition papers came through from the Northern Assembly this morning. The legal framework had taken nearly the full year. The wolfless standing law was now simply gone, replaced by language that the Beta General had declared unglamorous, but correct. Designation was not a prerequisite for dignity, participation, or bond. Aldrich had read the new text aloud to her over breakfast, and she had corrected 2 phrases, and he had made the corrections without comment and submitted the final version. She looked at the stone. He chose a quiet life, and lived it well. The dead hear only what is true, she said. She had said it to him in the graveyard, the first day, and he had remembered it, and somewhere in the year it had become the saying of their household, the thing that the staff knew meant to be honest here, even when it cost something. She reached into her lapel and unpinned the gray feather. She had carried it for 15 years. It was worn soft with handling, the vein slightly split, the quill warm from her body heat. She had carried it through the laundry and the dismissal and the walk to Feldwick and the long negotiation of becoming someone whose name the law now recognized. She had carried it as a reminder of what she was for, tending the overlooked, staying present for the alone, giving voice to the truth even when nobody was listening. Aldrich watched her, reading her face the way he had learned to read it, which was with genuine attention and no agenda. She pressed the feather gently against the base of Bren's stone, the same way she had on the first day she'd knelt here, not knowing whose grave it was, only knowing it was alone. "It's time," she said simply. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had in the inn's small library, palm offered, fingers closing when she arrived. She leaned into his shoulder and felt the warmth of him, the solidity of something that had chosen her with the whole of itself. The wind picked up across the slope. Somewhere above them, a crow called once. The feather stayed where she had placed it, pressed into the earth, gone to its rest. The dead hear only what is true. And so, at last, did the living. End.